The wreckage burned against the violet sky of Aetheron Prime, and the dying human scout ship had torn through 3 atmosphere layers before crashing into the crystalline forests of the northern continent, and Captain Maya Rodriguez dragged herself from the smoking cockpit with her hazard suit shredded and her emergency beacon screaming uselessly into the void. And Earth was 600 light-years away, and the Terran defense fleet had lost this sector 3 weeks ago, and she was alone. Or, so she thought until she saw the figure watching her from the tree line, and at first Maya mistook her for human, because the silhouette was familiar enough, and tall, and graceful. But as the stranger stepped into the light of the twin suns' reality, shifted and pointed ears swept back from an angular face and skin like moonlit silver, and eyes that glowed with an inner luminescence the color of distant nebulae, and the woman wore armor that seemed grown rather than forged with organic plates, that shifted and breathed with her movements, and coiled around her shoulders with wings folded tight against its serpentine body, was a dragon no larger than a house cat, and scales shimmering between crimson and gold, and eyes sharp with predatory intelligence. The woman spoke, and her voice was musical and strange, and she was speaking flawless English that should not have been possible. And she said, "You fell from the sky, and I watched you burn through the clouds like a dying comet. And are all humans so careless with their lives?" Maya's hand went to her sidearm, but exhaustion made her slow, and she asked, "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head with an expression of amusement dancing across her alien features and said, "My people call me Calith Starwhisper and 7th daughter of the Luminary Empire and Princess of the Void." Touched bloodline, and she paused as the tiny dragon on her shoulder chirped softly, "And this is Ember. And he thinks you smell interesting." Maya muttered, "Great. And a princess, and that is just what I need," while checking her weapon charge, and it showed 12%. But Calith's expression had already shifted, and the playfulness drained away as she looked past Maya toward the horizon and said, "You need to leave this place, and the Dominion hunts here now, and they are hunting me." And her luminous eyes fixed on Maya with sudden intensity, and she said, "Take me with you, human, and your ship may be broken, but you have resources, and knowledge, and ways off this world, and I can help you survive, and I can help you fight," Maya said flatly. "My ship is slag, and I am not going anywhere." Calith stepped closer, and Ember unfurled his wings, and each was no wider than Maya's hand. But the threat was clear, and the princess said quietly, "Then we will both die here, and the Dominion does not take prisoners, and not anymore. And not since they learned what my blood can do." Maya stared at her, and at this impossible alien princess, with her impossible dragon, and felt the weight of every terrible decision she had ever made pressing down on her shoulders, and she thought of the evacuation orders she had ignored, and the coordinates she had followed into dead space, and the secret that had brought her to this forsaken world in the first place. Maya said slowly, "If I am going to die, I might as well know why and what makes you so special that an empire would burn a world to find you." Calith smiled, and it was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and said, "Because I know how to kill them, Captain Rodriguez and the Dominion, and the swarm that has devoured 1,000 worlds and enslaved 1,000 more, and I know their weakness." And she held out one silver hand and said, "I will share it with you, if you will help me escape this place and my knowledge for your survival and my war for your freedom." Maya looked at the offered hand for a long moment, and in the distance something howled, and it was a sound like metal tearing and like reality, screaming, and the Dominion was coming. She took Calith's hand. Maya said, "All right, princess, and looks like you just joined the Terran Defense Fleet, and welcome aboard." Ember chirped again, and somewhere in the ruins of her ship, Maya's emergency beacon finally went silent. The war had found her after all, and they moved through the crystalline forest like ghosts, with Calith leading the way, with an ease that spoke of intimate familiarity with this alien terrain, and Ember flew ahead in short bursts, and his small form darting between the transparent trees that reflected the twin suns in cascading rainbows, and Maya followed with her military training, keeping her alert despite the exhaustion, dragging at her limbs. Calith spoke as they walked, and her voice was low and measured, and she said, "The Dominion has not always been what it is now, and 5,000 years ago they were like you, and explorers and dreamers and builders of cities and songs. And then they found the chorus." Maya checked. Her scanner and 3 heat signatures were moving parallel to their position, and 2 kilometers out, and hunters. And she asked, What is the chorus? Calith's expression darkened, and she said, a technology, and a religion, and a virus, and no one remembers. Which and the chorus connected their minds and made them one voice and one purpose, and they thought it would bring peace. And she gestured to the sky where the distant shapes of Dominion war spheres hung like black moons. And she said instead, it brought this and an empire that consumes everything it touches and adding each conquered species to its collective consciousness and perfection through assimilation and unity, through annihilation. Maya had read the intelligence reports and watched the tactical briefings and entire human colonies going dark and distress signals that stopped mid-transmission, and ships found drifting with crews missing, and nothing left but empty corridors and the faint echo of singing. And she said, Earth high. Command thinks it is a hive mind, an insectoid maybe, or machine intelligence. Calith said sharply, they are wrong, and the Dominion is both more and less than that, and every mind they consume still exists within the chorus and aware and screaming, entrapped in an eternity of forced unity. And she stopped walking and turned to face Maya and said my mother was a cipher sage, and one of the few who could hear the chorus without being consumed by it, and she spent 300 years studying their signal and learning their language and finding the cracks in their collective soul. Maya stared at her and asked, 300 years, and how old are you? Calith replied, old enough to have lost everything I loved to this war, and something in her voice made Maya stop asking questions. They reached a cliff face that seemed unremarkable, and just another wall of crystalline stone. But Calith pressed her palm against it and spoke something in a language that made Maya's translator implant scream with static, and the stone rippled like water and revealed a passage that led down into darkness. Calith said the archives of whispered stars and my mother's life work and everything she learned about the Dominion and every weakness she discovered and every potential weapon against them. And she looked at Maya with those nebula-bright eyes and said, the Dominion knows this place exists, and that is why they hunt me. And I am the only one left who knows the way, and Maya followed her into the darkness with her sidearm raised and her tactical light cutting through the shadows, and the passage opened into a vast chamber, and Maya's breath caught in her throat, and the walls were covered in symbols that seemed to move when she was not looking directly at them, and equations and diagrams and star maps that hurt to comprehend. And at the center of the room stood a pillar of pure light, and within it, suspended like insects in amber, were dozens of crystalline data cores. Calith whispered, and her voice was filled with reverence and grief, and she said, this is everything. And 5 millennia of research, and the chorus has one critical flaw and one single point where the entire network can be disrupted. And my mother found it, and she died before she could weaponize it, and she turned to Maya and said, but the data is here, and the specifications and the frequencies and the exact harmonic resonance needed to shatter their connection. Maya breathed the word weapon, and you are talking about building a weapon that could destroy the Dominion. Calith corrected her and said, not destroy and free, and every mind trapped in the chorus, and every consciousness screaming in that eternal prison, and we can release them and break their unity and return them to themselves. And her hands clenched into fists, and she said, it will kill billions. And the chorus has lasted so long that most of its components do not remember how to be individuals anymore. And they will die the moment they are separated, but some will survive and some will be free. Ember landed on Maya's shoulder, and she felt the tiny dragon's warmth through her damaged suit, and the creature was watching her with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for something so small. Maya asked quietly, why me, and why tell a random human pilot about this? And you could have contacted Earth High Command and could have gone through official channels. Calith interrupted and said, because I have been watching your species for 3 years, and I have seen how your military thinks and how your politicians plan, and they would take this knowledge and lock it away and study it for decades, while the Dominion consumes more worlds, and or worse, they would try to use it as leverage and threaten the Dominion with it to negotiate some pathetic treaty that buys Earth a few more years of survival. And she stepped closer to Maya and said, but you, Captain Rodriguez, and you did not come to this world by accident, and you came here looking for something and running from something, and I can see it in how you carry yourself and in how you accepted my offer so quickly. Maya felt her jaw tighten, and the classified data chip hidden in her boot suddenly felt like it weighed 100 kilograms, and she said, I do not know what you are talking about. Kaleth's smile was sad, and she said, yes, you do. And you are a deserter or a spy or a rebel who stole something your superiors did not want you to have. And it does not matter which. And what matters is that you are someone who acts instead of waiting for permission, and someone who might actually use this weapon instead of burying it in bureaucracy and fear. The words hung in the air between them, and Maya wanted to deny it, and wanted to defend herself, but what was the point? And Kaleth was right, and Maya had stolen the coordinates to this world from a dead scientist's terminal, and had gone AWOL from her posting, and had followed a hunch that had turned into a suicide. Mission, Maya asked quietly. How do we build it? Kaleth's expression shifted, and for the first time since they had met, Maya saw something that might have been hope. And she said, we will need a fabricator and military grade, not civilian in access, to a power source capable of generating at least 6 terawatts sustained. And time and at least 3 weeks? Maybe 4, Maya said. My ship's fabricator might still be operational and fusion core is intact. And I checked before I bailed out, but 3 weeks, and the Dominion will find us long before then. Kaleth said simply, then we fight. And Ember chirped in agreement, and a small gout of flame escaped his nostrils, and she said, we hold them off, and we complete the weapon, and we end this. Maya looked at the alien princess and at her impossible dragon, and at the archives that promised genocide and liberation in equal measure, and she thought about Earth, and about the billions who would die if the Dominion was not stopped, and she thought about the mission she had abandoned and the orders she had disobeyed, and the bridge she had burned when she had stolen those coordinates. Maya said, all right, and let us save the galaxy. Outside in the crystalline forest, the Dominion's hunters were getting closer, and they could hear the chorus now, and a distant singing that scraped against the edges of their minds like knives against glass. And time was running out. The war had truly begun, and the Dominion found them on the 4th day. Maya had managed to salvage enough of her ship's systems to create a makeshift workshop in the archive's outer chambers, and the fabricator hummed day and night and printing components according to specifications that Kaleth translated from her mother's. Research and Ember had grown, and not physically but in presence, and his flames burning hotter, and his eyes sharper as if the dragon could sense the approaching storm. They came at dawn, when the twin suns painted the crystalline forest in shades of blood and gold, and Maya's perimeter sensors screamed warnings before going silent one by one, and consumed by the advancing swarm. And she stood at the archive entrance watching the tree line, and her salvaged plasma rifle humming with barely contained energy. Kaleth asked, materializing beside her like smoke, and how many. Maya's jaw clenched, and she said 60 and maybe 70, and all synced to the chorus, and they move like one organism. Kaleth said, they are one organism, and she raised one hand, and Ember launched from her shoulder, and the small dragon suddenly expanding mid-flight and wings unfurled to span 10 meters, and scales shifting from crimson to obsidian, and flames gathering in his throat like a newborn star, and she said, but we have fought the Dominion before, and we know how they think and how they bleed. The first wave hit like a hammer. They were not human, and not anymore, and the Dominion had twisted them into something else, and bodies augmented with biomechanical horror, and minds subsumed into the chorus's eternal song, and they moved in perfect synchronization and weapons firing in coordinated patterns that should have been impossible for individual soldiers to execute, and but Kaleth and Ember fought like they had been born in war's crucible. The dragon breathed fire that melted stone and flesh alike, and Kaleth moved through the chaos like a dancer, and her weapons and blades that sang with harmonic frequencies and cutting through Dominion. Warriors with surgical precision, and Maya held the line, and her military training taking over, and her shots calculated and devastating. Maya shouted over the chaos and the weapon and how much longer. Kaleth parried a Dominion soldier's strike, and her blade humming, and she shouted 18 hours for the core, and another 6 for calibration. Maya's rifle was running hot, and the cooling system struggling to keep up, and she said, we do not have 24 hours, and they will overwhelm us in 12. Ember crashed into a cluster of Dominion fighters, and his massive form crushing them beneath scaled bulk, but more kept coming, and always more. And the chorus did not care about casualties, and every fallen soldier was just one voice among billions, and easily replaced and barely mourned. That was when Maya saw it and the commander, and it hung back from the main assault in a figure twice the size of the others, and its body a grotesque fusion of a dozen species. And when it spoke, its voice echoed with the weight of the entire chorus. The commander said, "Maya Rodriguez, and captain and deserter and thief," and the words came from every Dominion soldier simultaneously, and a chorus of accusations, and it said, "You carry classified data, and coordinates to human research stations and specifications for experimental weapons, and surrender, and we will add your knowledge to our perfection, and resist, and we will take it from your dying mind." Kalith's eyes widened, and she asked, "Is that?" Maya did not answer, and she did not need to, and the data chip hidden in her boot felt like it was burning. Kalith demanded even as she fought, "And what did you steal, and what could be so important that you would risk everything?" Maya fired a burst that took down 3 soldiers, and she said later, "And we survive first and interrogate second." But the Dominion commander was already adapting, and it had heard the exchange, and processed it, and integrated it into the chorus's collective strategy, and the attack pattern changed, and soldiers stopped trying to kill them, and started trying to capture and to subdue and to drag Maya back to their collective, so they could extract every secret she carried. Kalith saw it too, and she said, "They want you alive, and that gives us an advantage," and she grabbed Maya's arm in her grip like steel and said, "Get to the fabricator and finish the weapon, and Ember and I will hold them." Maya said, "You will die." Kalith's eyes blazed with defiance, and she said, "Then I die free, and my mother spent 3 centuries on this research, Captain, and I will not let her sacrifice me nothing." And Go Ember roared agreement, and a sound that shook the crystal trees, and made the Dominion soldiers hesitate for just a moment, and just long enough for Maya to run. She sprinted through the archive corridors, and the sounds of battle echoing behind her, and the fabricator was where she had left it, and 3/4 finished with the weapon's central core, and a device that looked more like musical instrument than something designed to shatter an empire. And Maya's hands flew over the controls and overriding safety protocols and pushing the machine past its rated limits. 16 hours, and she had to compress. 16 hours of work into 6 and maybe 4 and maybe less above. She could hear Kalith and Ember fighting with desperate ferocity, and the princess was buying her time with blood and courage and holding back an army with nothing but skill and determination and the unbreakable bond between warrior and dragon. Maya worked, and her fingers danced across holographic interfaces and programming frequencies and harmonics she barely understood, and following instructions left by an alien scientist who had died before Maya was born, and the math was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and this weapon would not just disrupt the chorus, and it would rewrite the fundamental frequencies that held their collective consciousness together, and it would tear apart the very thing that made them a unified force. It would free them, and it would kill most of them in the process. Hours blurred together, and Maya barely noticed when the sounds of battle moved closer, and when the archive walls began to shake with nearby explosions, and she was lost in the work and in the terrible necessity of what she was creating. And then Kalith was there and bleeding from a dozen wounds, and Ember shrunk back to his small form and cradled in her arms. And the dragon's scales were dull, and his breathing labored. Kalith gasped, "And they are breaking through in 5 minutes and maybe less, and is it done?" Maya looked at the weapon, and complete and humming with potential, and ready to end a war, and she said, "It is done. And but there is a problem." Kalith asked, "What problem?" Maya pulled up the weapon specifications, and she said, "It needs a carrier, and something that can broadcast the disruption signal across multiple star systems simultaneously, and it needs to be delivered to the heart of the Dominion network, and the central node where the chorus's signal originates." Kalith's expression went very still, and she said, "That is a suicide mission." Maya said yes. They stared at each other as the archive shook with another explosion, and the Dominion was at the door, and time was up, Kalith said quietly. "I will do it, and this was my mother's mission and my burden to carry." Maya said no, and she pulled the data chip from her boot and held it up so Kalith could see, and she said, "This chip, and it contains the location of Earth's experimental jump drive prototype, and one use and untested and probably fatal, and but if it works, it could get someone to the Dominion core in seconds instead of weeks." And she smiled grimly and said, "I stole it because I thought I could use it to escape and run away from everything, and but maybe this is what it was always meant for." Kalith looked genuinely shocked, and she asked, "You would sacrifice yourself and for my war, and for my people. Maya corrected, and for everyone's war, and for all the people trapped in that chorus and screaming for freedom, and for Earth, and for every world. The Dominion will consume if we do not stop them. And she loaded the chip into the weapons control system and said, "Besides, I am already dead in the moment I went AWOL and the moment I stole this data, and I was dead and might as well make it count for something." Ember chirped weakly from Calith's arms, and the princess's eyes shimmered with something that might have been tears, and she whispered, "You humans, and you are all completely insane." Maya said, "Takes one to know one, princess," and she activated the weapon and felt it begin to sync with the jump drive's specifications and said, "When this goes off, the chorus will shatter, but there will be chaos and confusion and millions of minds suddenly freed after thousands of years of forced unity, and some of them will need help, and some of them will need guidance." Calith finished, "And some of them will need someone who understands what they have been through," and she straightened, and despite her wounds and despite her exhaustion, she looked every bit the princess she claimed to be and said, "I will help them and the freed ones, and I will make sure my mother's sacrifice means something." The archive door exploded inward, and Dominion soldiers poured through the breach, and their weapons raised and their voices united in the chorus's terrible song. Maya grabbed the weapon and ran toward the center of the room and toward the pillar of light where Calith's mother had stored her research, and she could feel the jump drive activating and feel reality beginning to tear around her. Maya shouted to Calith over the chaos, and tell Earth what happened here, and tell them the Dominion can be beaten. Calith was fighting again and buying Maya precious seconds, and her blades singing their deadly harmony, and she shouted, "I will, and I swear it, Captain, and your sacrifice will be remembered." The jump drive engaged and space-folded, and Maya felt herself being pulled apart and put back together, and felt the weapon in her hands begin to pulse with building energy, and she was moving now and faster than light and faster than thought, and pulled toward the Dominion core by coordinates she had only seen once and burned into her memory in that moment of desperate theft. The last thing she saw before reality went white was Calith raising one hand in salute, and Ember perched on her shoulder, and both of them silhouetted against the archive's dying light. Then she was elsewhere and elsewhen, and at the heart of an empire built on stolen minds and broken dreams, and in her hands she held the key to its undoing. The Dominion core was beautiful, in the way that supernovas are beautiful and vast and terrible and utterly incomprehensible to human perception, and Maya materialized in the heart of it, and the stolen jump drive burning itself to slag as it completed its one impossible journey. And around her, stretching into infinity, was the physical manifestation of the chorus, and a sphere of pure energy, kilometers in diameter, and pulsing with the combined consciousness of a billion minds. She could hear them, and all of them, and screaming. The weapon hummed in her hands, and its harmonic resonators already beginning their deadly work, and Maya had minutes at most, and the chorus had detected her presence, and was already adapting, and sending antibodies through the energy matrix to eliminate this foreign intrusion, and she could see them coming, and waves of defensive constructs that looked like living mathematics given form. But she had known this would be a one-way trip, and had accepted it the moment she had activated the jump drive. And now all that mattered was finishing what Calith's mother had started 5 millennia ago. Maya triggered the weapon's primary sequence. The sound that emerged was not sound at all, and it was the opposite of music, and the antithesis of harmony, and a frequency designed to shatter the very bonds that held the chorus together, and it spread through the energy sphere like cracks through glass, and each fracture point releasing a mind that had been trapped for centuries, and some of them died instantly, and their consciousness too fragmented to survive separation, but others and others began to wake. The Dominion fought back, and the defensive constructs reached Maya, and she felt them tearing into her physical form and rewriting her biology at the molecular level, and it hurt worse than anything she had imagined, but she held onto the weapon and kept it active, and even as her body began to fail, she thought about Calith, and hoped the princess had escaped the archive, and hoped she would find a way to help all these freed minds and to guide them through the chaos that was about to engulf the galaxy. And she thought about Earth, and about all the people who would never know that an AWOL captain had saved them from assimilation, and she thought about her family and her friends and everyone she had left behind when she had stolen those coordinates and run toward her fate. No regrets, Maya thought as the darkness closed in, and not anymore. The weapon reached critical harmonics and the chorus shattered, and Maya Rodriguez died, knowing she had freed an empire. 5 months later, on Earth Orbital Station, Athena and Kalith stood before the Terran Defense Council, and Ember perched on her shoulder, in his small form, and she told them everything, and the archive and the research and the weapon and Maya Rodriguez's sacrifice. Kalith said, and her voice carrying across the council chamber, and your captain saved billions and across 3,000. Star systems the Dominion's grip has broken, and species we thought lost forever are rebuilding their civilizations, and some have rejoined the galactic community, and some have chosen isolation, but all of them are free. Admiral Grace Patterson leaned forward, and she was an older woman with steel-gray hair, and eyes that had seen too many wars. And she asked, and the ones who did not survive the separation, and the ones who died when the chorus shattered, Kalith did not flinch, and she said quietly, 700 billion and 700 billion minds too damaged by centuries of forced unity to exist as individuals, and they died the moment they were freed. And she paused and said, but they died themselves, and not as parts of something else and not as slaves to the chorus, and they died free. The council chamber was silent for a long moment, and finally Admiral Patterson spoke again, and she said, Captain Rodriguez was AWOL and a deserter, and she stole classified data and went on an unauthorized mission into hostile territory. Kalith said yes. Patterson continued, and she violated a dozen regulations and broke her oath and abandoned her. Kalith said yes. Patterson's expression softened just slightly, and she said she also saved humanity from assimilation and liberated the largest empire in known space. And the Admiral stood and said, this council hereby posthumously promotes Maya Rodriguez to the rank of Admiral and awards her the Terran Star of Valor and formally recognizes her actions as the single most significant contribution to the war effort in human history. Kalith felt something in her chest unclench, and she said, thank you. Patterson said, do not thank us yet. And because you are not done, Princess, and those freed species you mentioned, and they are confused and scared, and some of them are fighting each other and falling into civil wars and chaos, and they need guidance and leadership and someone who understands what they have been through. Kalith said, I know, and that is why I am leaving tomorrow, and Ember and I, and we are going to visit every world we can reach and offer what help we can and try to prevent the liberation from becoming another catastrophe. Patterson said, you will need a ship and supplies and support. Kalith smiled, and it was sad and determined in equal measure. And she said, what I need is for humanity to remember Captain Maya Rodriguez, and to remember that one person acting on conscience instead of orders can change the fate of galaxies. And she looked around the council chamber and meeting each representative's eyes and said, your species asks a question that my people stopped asking millennia ago. And what if? And what if I try? And what if I fight? And what if I refuse to accept what I am told is inevitable? And she touched Ember gently, and the dragon chirped and said, Maya asked what if? And the universe answered. Patterson nodded slowly, and she said, she will be remembered, Princess, and I will see to that personally. And the Admiral paused and said, and if you ever need humanity's help out there among the freed worlds, and all you have to do is ask. Kalith said, I know, and Maya told me, your people would come, and that humans have this strange habit of helping even when it is inconvenient, and even when it is dangerous, and even when they get nothing in return. And she turned to leave, then stopped, and said one more thing. Admiral and Maya had a family, and parents, and a sister, I think, and make sure they know what she did, and make sure they know she was a hero. Patterson said, consider it done. Kalith walked out of the council chamber, and Ember warm on her shoulder, and looked out at the stars beyond Earth's orbit, and somewhere out there across 3,000 systems, minds were waking up and remembering themselves and learning to be individuals again after centuries of enforced unity. It would take years and maybe decades and maybe longer. But Kalith had time, and she had a promise to keep, and to Maya, and to her mother, and to everyone who had suffered under the Dominion song. She said softly, come on, Ember, and we have work to do. The dragon chirped agreement, and small flames flickering around his nostrils, and together the alien princess and her dragon walked toward the docking bay and toward a ship that would carry them to the next world, and the next crisis, and the next chance to honor a human captain's legacy. Behind them, Earth turned in the darkness, and safe for now and saved by a woman who had broken every rule and died to make it possible. The war was over, but the work of peace had only just begun. 2 years after the shattering, and the memorial was simple and too simple. Maya's sister, Kate, said for someone who had saved the galaxy, but Kalith thought it was perfect, and a black stone pillar on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and Maya's name carved in letters that caught the sunset light, and no speeches and no politicians, and just family and a few old friends and an alien princess who had traveled 600 light years to be there. Kate Rodriguez looked older than her 40 years, and the weight of suddenly having a famous sister pressing down on her shoulders, and she said they keep asking for interviews and books and movies and everyone wants to tell Maya's story. And she glanced at Kalith and said, "But none of them knew her." "And not really," Kalith said quietly. "Tell me about her," Kate smiled, and it was bittersweet. And she said she was stubborn and impossibly stubborn, and when we were kids she once spent 6 hours trying to fix our dad's ancient motorcycle, even though she had no idea what she was doing, and she refused to give up until it worked. And the smile faded and said that is who she was, and she saw a problem and she fixed it. And no matter the cost, Kalith said she saved my life and gave me a purpose when I thought everything was lost. And your sister was, and she paused, searching for the right words in this alien language, and said she was proof that individuals matter, and that one person acting on conscience can reshape reality. They stood in silence for a while, and watching the sun paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, and finally Kate spoke again, and she asked, "What will you do now?" "And I heard you have been traveling and helping the freed worlds," Kalith said. "I have, in 317 planets so far, and some are rebuilding beautifully and others." And she trailed off, thinking of the civil wars and the chaos and the species that had been part of the chorus for so long they did not remember how to govern themselves, and said others need more time and more help. Kate said, "And you are providing it." Kalith said, "Someone has to." And she turned to face Kate and said, "Your sister died to free them, and the least I can do is make sure her sacrifice was not wasted, and that they get a real chance at peace." Kate reached out and touched the memorial stone, and her fingers tracing Maya's name, and she said she would like that. And knowing someone was finishing what she started, and she looked at Kalith with eyes that held both grief and gratitude, and said thank you, and for being with her at the end, and for making sure she did not die alone. Kalith said firmly she was not alone, and she was with me and with Ember, and she was surrounded by the mind she freed, and billions of them waking up because of her courage, and the princess's luminous eyes caught the fading sunlight and said, "In my culture, we believe that heroes do not truly die and they become part of the stars, and watching over those they saved. And I like to think Maya is out there somewhere, and watching all those freed worlds, and seeing them build new futures." Ember chirped softly as if in agreement. They stayed until the sun set completely, and the first stars began to appear, and Kate eventually left. But not before hugging Kalith, and an awkward gesture between species, but meaningful nonetheless, and she said, "Come back, and if you are ever near Earth again, and let us know how it is going out there, and let us know Maya's legacy is alive." Kalith promised, "I will." She stood alone with Ember as night fell completely, and the memorial stone a dark silhouette against the starlit sky, and so many stars and so many worlds and so many lives changed by one human's impossible choice. Kalith said softly, "We should go, and the transport leaves in 4 hours, and the Nexus Federation is having their first democratic election in 5,000 years, and they asked me to observe and make sure it is fair." Ember stretched his wings, and, ready to fly, but Kalith did not move yet, and she was thinking about that day in the crystalline forest when a burning ship had fallen from the sky and changed everything, and she was thinking about the archives and the weapon and the desperate fight to buy time for a miracle. She was thinking about Maya's last words, and tell them the Dominion can be beaten. Kalith whispered to the memorial, and to the ghost of her friend, and to the stars beyond, and said, "We told them, and now, we are proving it, and every world that rebuilds, and every species that finds peace, and every freed mind that learns to dream again. And they are all proof that you were right, Maya, and that fighting impossible odds is worth it, and that one person can make a difference." Ember took flight and circling overhead, and his scales catching the starlight, and Kalith watched him for a moment, then pulled out her portable holo display, and messages waited, and requests for help, and reports from liberated worlds and invitations to peace conferences and reconstruction summits, and the work never ended. And the galaxy was vast. And there were so many who still needed guidance through the aftermath of freedom. But that was okay. And Kalith had time, and she had purpose, and she had Ember. She had a promise to keep one last time she touched the memorial stone, and she said, "Take me with you, human," and repeating the words she had spoken in the forest 2 years ago, and words that had started everything. And she said, "That is what I asked you, and you did, and you took me on a journey I never imagined and to places I never dreamed possible, and you showed me that courage is not about being fearless, and it is about being terrified and doing what is right anyway." Kalith looked up at the stars and at the vast canvas of the galaxy that Maya had died to free, and she said, "Now it is my turn, Captain, and I will take your legacy with me. And to every world and every species and every freed mind that needs to know that sacrifice has meaning and that heroism is real, and that one person's choice can echo across the cosmos." Ember descended and landing on her shoulder with practiced ease, and the dragon was larger now and stronger. But he still preferred to ride with her like this, and a reminder of simpler times and of desperate battles and impossible victories. Kalith asked him, "Ready, Ember," chirped, and flames flickering softly around his nostrils, and always ready and always willing to fly into whatever came next. Together they walked away from the memorial and toward the transport that would carry them back to the stars, and behind them, Earth turned in the darkness, and safe and whole, and protected by a hero's sacrifice. And ahead of them lay 300 billion freed minds and thousands of worlds rebuilding, and a galaxy learning to dream again. The chorus was shattered, and the dominion was broken, and in the spaces between the stars, and in the quiet moments between crises, the freed species whispered stories of the human who had saved them, and some got the details wrong and some turned her into a myth, but all of them remembered the essential truth. One person had refused to accept the inevitable, and one person had asked what if and changed everything. One person had mattered, and her name was Maya Rodriguez. 20 years after the shattering and the first galactic assembly met on Luminara Prime and Kalith's homeworld, and in a city rebuilt from the ashes of Dominion occupation, and representatives from 400 species gathered in the Hall of Remembrance, and a structure designed to honor all those lost to the chorus over 5 millennia of enslavement. At the center of the hall stood a statue, and not of a warrior or a politician or a conqueror, but of a woman in a damaged pilot suit and holding a weapon that looked more like a musical instrument than a tool of war, and her face was determined, and her eyes focused on some distant horizon admiral. Maya Rodriguez. The statue was made from crystallized data cores taken from the archive of Whispered Stars, and each one containing a fragment of the research that had made liberation possible, and it caught the light from Luminara's twin suns and scattered it into rainbows that danced across the assembly floor. Kalith stood before it, and older now but no less fierce, and Ember massive and magnificent at her side, and the dragon had grown over the years, and his wingspan reaching 30 meters, and his flames capable of melting starship hulls, but he was still her companion and her partner and her friend. Kate Rodriguez said, standing beside Kalith, and 20 years and 20 years of peace and rebuilding and learning to be a galactic community instead of an empire of slaves. Kalith corrected gently, not perfect peace, and there have been conflicts and border disputes and trade wars and all the messy complications of freedom. Kate laughed, and she said Maya would have loved that. And she always said, perfect peace was a myth, and that the best you could hope for was managed chaos and people trying to do better. The assembly began, and for 6 hours representatives spoke about trade agreements and mutual defense pacts and cultural exchange programs and all the machinery of a galaxy trying to function as a community, and it was boring and beautiful in equal measure, and the mundane miracle of different species talking instead of fighting. And when the formal business was done, they held the Festival of Freed Stars. Music filled the hall, and not the forced unity of the chorus, but a genuine symphony of different voices and different instruments and different cultures, all contributing to something larger than themselves. And people danced, and people laughed, and people celebrated the messy and complicated and beautiful chaos of freedom. Calith found herself pulled into a conversation with a Nexus philosopher and then a human artist, and then a trio of young Dominion, descendants who had never known the chorus but carried the weight of their ancestors' sins, and she spoke with all of them, and listened to their stories and offered what wisdom she could. This was her life now, and this was the promise she had kept. Midnight. They dimmed the lights and projected images of the freed onto the hall ceiling, and billions of faces and billions of names and scrolling across the artificial sky like stars, and at the center and larger than the rest, and shining brightest Maya, Rodriguez, and the one who asked what if Ember roared, and a sound of triumph and sorrow and flame lit the darkness, and not destructive fire but celebration and life and warmth, and other dragons joined him, and creatures freed from the dominions, genetic experiments, and together they painted the sky with light. Kate was crying, and so was Calith, and so were most of the assembled representatives, and each one thinking of those they had lost, and those they had saved, and those they had failed. To save, Kate said through her tears she would hate this and all this attention and all this ceremony, and Maya just wanted to do the right thing. Calith replied, "Then we will honor her by doing the same, and every day and in every choice, and we will ask what if, and we will refuse to accept the inevitable, and we will fight for what is right, and even when it is hard, and especially when it is hard." The festival continued until dawn, and when Luminara's twin suns rose over the rebuilt city, the assembled representatives stood together, and human and Luminari and Nexus and former Dominion and hundreds of species, and they made a declaration, the Galactic Covenant of Free Minds. "We, the freed species of the galaxy, do hereby declare that no sentient being shall ever again be forced into collective consciousness, and that every mind has the right to be individual, and to choose and to dream alone or together as they wish. And we pledge to defend this freedom with everything we possess, and remembering always the price paid for our liberation. This covenant is established in honor of Admiral Maya Rodriguez, who showed us that one person's courage can shatter empires and birth new futures." Calith signed for the Luminari, and Kate signed for humanity, and 400 other representatives added their marks and their seals and their promises, and somewhere in the spaces between stars, and in the quantum foam, where consciousness and physics intersect, perhaps Maya Rodriguez smiled. Her war was over, but her legacy had only just begun.